number 5 has now started, where in this paragraph or this chapter, we will mainly focus on energy balance. And then in the next lectures, we will focus more on nitrogen balance as well as on water balance. So if we start, then we can compare everything that you take in. This is what we call ingesta. So it could be food or water or air. And this is compared with the so-called egesta. This is everything that we lose. For example, urine, fecal material, gases, etc. Production parameters like breast milk, muscle, in case of growing tissues, or pregnancy are also considered as egesta, because they are usually also coming in addition to what you normally need for normal maintenance. So the principle now is that you take a balance technique whereby we look at ingesta versus egesta. If you are in a period of shortage, then it means that the intake is lower than the use, so the egesta. You could be in equilibrium or you could be in excess when the intake, the ingesta, is higher than the egesta. So the first one gives you, undernutrition. The second one should be the optimal balance. And the third one could give you overweight and obesity. So this principle is quite clear, but of course it is only a black box. We do not know exactly what is going on technically within the human body. It's only measuring what comes in and what finally goes out. Energy is more complex than we originally thought. So you could say, I need a certain amount of energy, and we can put a value on that. But in reality, in human beings, we have several types of energy. The first one we call the gross energy, which is abbreviated as GE. And that is the total amount of energy that technically is contained within a food product. If you start consuming this, then you have losses during digestion, which actually are then fecal energy, the energy that we can physically find back in fecal material, as well as part of the gas energy, mainly the energy which is produced during gastrointestinal digestion and which doesn't leave the body, which is not absorbed in the body. So it actually leaves together with fecal material the GI tract. And this is a netto loss for humans because gas energy could mainly be methane, and methane is actually an energy-containing component. If you subtract from the gross energy, fecal energy and gas energy, what is maintained is so-called digestible energy. So the total amount of energy that can be digested at the level of the GI tract. Once this is digested and absorbed, you again have losses. And the first loss is the urinary energy, which could be mainly ureum that still contains energy, but that is actually physically lost in the urine. And secondly, the second component of gas energy, that's all the gas which is physically absorbed in the body and which is expired by using the breath. So digestible energy minus urinary energy minus gas energy from the breath is called metabolizable energy. So this is the total amount of energy which is actually available for human metabolism after correction for digestion, after correction for the losses that could occur in the urine. The metabolizable energy can then be converted into the net energy. Net energy is something that we can physically see. I'm thinking, for example, about deposited tissue or moving, for example, from point A to point B. These are all types of net energies. And the conversion from metabolizable energy to net energy gives you a loss, and these losses are heat losses. And in some circumstances, you will see that later, this can be quite substantial. So 4 different types of energy, actually more than 4, I think 4 plus 5, 6, 7, at least 7 different types of energy that we can find in humans. But only one of them is the energy that can be found on the package of food products. So you have been working a lot with packages the last couple of weeks for your exercise. You always have been working with kilocalories and kilojoules that you can find either in the tables or either on the package of the product. So my question to you is now, if you could think a little bit further to try and understand which type of energy is mainly physically present on the labels. So which energy can you find on the labels of food products? Just think a little bit about it and try to motivate your answer. If we look to ingestion and egestions, then we can see that there is a significant difference throughout the day. If you look to an ordinary person, there's a breakfast where food is taken in, so energy comes in. There could be a snack. There could also be lunchtime, evening meals, and a second snack. So we have a sort of a discontinuous intake of food, but we have a continuous use of energy. As you can see here, even if you're sleeping, you're still using energy. And then, depending on the activity that you're doing, it can fluctuate quite strongly with some peaks and some low moments throughout the day. And so we have to understand that the body regulating mechanism is built in such a way that you have a discontinuous intake of energy, which is converted into a continuous loss of energy or use of energy. And these mechanisms are quite tight, and if they are very well controlled, in principle, you will not get obese because it's perfectly regulating the intake together with what you actually need. Obesity can develop when you, for example, very slowly deviate from the ideal situation. So every day you take in a small amount of extra calories, but that one day it will never be noticeable on a total diet. But if you would look at it over months and it would always be the same issue, then of course the small amounts of energy from the day will all add up to a quite serious amount of energy that you took in extra above what you normally should eat. And it also illustrates that probably in the human body, energy metabolism is very tightly regulated. And so we are perfectly capable of converting this discontinuous supply into a continuous use of energy throughout the day. And I will explain a little bit about these regulating mechanisms in some of the next slides. If we look to the energy that is physically entrapped within the human body, then it's very different according to whether it is carbohydrate, protein, or adipose tissue, so lipids. If we take an average person with a weight of about 65 kilograms, then you can see that the amount of free glucose, which is circulating mainly in the bloodstream, is only 12 grams. So technically speaking, it's not really a very huge amount of glucose that is physically there, but it is very important because it is this glucose that normally should be fed towards the brains, and the brains are very active on the basis of glucose. A human adult person should normally have around 450 grams of glycogen, which can be stored in the liver as well as in the muscles. And in the adipose tissue, we have 15 kilograms of adipose tissue. Don't forget that an important part of the adipose tissue is actually water. And we have about 15 kilograms in this case, while for protein, we have mainly protein in the muscles. We have here around 12.5 kilograms, which means that if you would start using exclusively your muscles, then you will have enough energy for a total period of time of 23 days. If you use all the adipose tissue, it will be 59 days. If you use the glycogen, only 18 hours. And if you use the free glucose, which is circulating in the blood, you only can survive for about 30 minutes. So it gives you very clearly an idea how much energy is contained within the human body and what time frame is required in order to destabilize it or to fully use it as an internal energy source. An important process that has developed in the last couple of years, and that's why I added a reference to Euphora, which is the reference of Hernandez and Garcia, which is a fully overview article on Canadian circadian rhythms. It's a quite new technology, but it's quite important that you understand how it works. So circadian rhythms actually means that within the human body, we have a sort of a biological clock. So our body is actually trained according to whether it is daytime or nighttime. And so, for example, you wake up in the morning and the first light shines through the window, touches the eyes, you open the eyes. At that moment, there are already information going to the brains that the whole system should start to be activated because you are awake again, you want to wake up, you want to start working. So this process is actually stimulated by light intensity. And so the light comes in, and then the circadian clock will activate all the different genes responsible for the production of enzymes, for the digestion of foods, for the uptake of nutrients, for the consumption and the use of nutrients to produce energy. This whole process is actually activated by increased expression of the related genes. It seems that food can do a similar pulse or movement. So when you start consuming food, there will also be information going to the brains, which there can also be activated, creating similar effects whereby enzymes, digestive enzymes, enzymes located near the storage vessels could all be activated so that all the food and the nutrients taken up can either be stored or can either be physically used. And this is quite constant throughout the day. So people that have a very monotonous way of living, which is very repeatable. So you wake up at 8 in the morning, for example, you eat, and then you go to school or to class. You eat at lunchtime, and in the evening you come back home and you eat again. So all these things are standardized. In that case, the body can already predict what is going to happen. It can already separate and release enzymes from the GI tract. It can retract blood from other tissues like muscles to be controlled mainly in the intestine so that it's much easier to pick up more nutrients after the digestion stages. It seems that this circadian rhythm is not only found at the level of the brains, or generally speaking, the level of one organ. We can see that it can also be influenced by the circadian rhythms in different other organs of the body, namely the adipose tissue, the liver, and the intestines. And so we can see that when you're eating, it could be that there are also several circadian rhythms activated, by which you have more storage of fat in the adipose tissue, more release or detoxification of compounds at the level of the liver, and more absorption and metabolization of nutrients at the level of the colon. Feeding regimes or light intensity indirectly through the brains can also have secondary effects, like, for example, running, sleeping, or being awake, and effects on heart rhythms. So all these elements, technically speaking, could all be influenced by the presence of circadian rhythms. And so you can more or less play with this because we know that the circadian rhythm has a significant influence on disease outcome. For example, today there's quite a popular strategy to go for time-restricted feeding, which actually means that you only eat food during certain time frames of the day. For example, you could wake up in the morning at around 6, and throughout the day, you're not eating, or you only eat it in a limited way. While in the evenings, for example, in the nights, you don't eat at all. And so this is a time-restricted eating period, which gives you, in this case, a clear view on circadian rhythms. So all the clock genes are activated in the morning as soon as you start eating, and they are deactivated in the evening when you stop eating. So in this case, if this clock is working already for a while and your dietary patterns during the day are quite repeatable, in those situations, the body can quite well predict how much food it needs and how much physically should be stored. So the chances that you will become obese in these situations is a little bit limited. And because the whole circadian rhythm system is nicely in balance and in control. It could also be that you have a time-restricted eating, but at this time you don't really eat during the daytime, which is your normal working and eating times. But for example, it is during the nighttime. And this happens, for example, students who are having a quite stable regime during the week, for example, from Monday to Friday, when you are waking up in the morning to go to class, and in the evening you come back for having dinner, those types of things. While in the weekends, for example, it could be completely different because there are no classes. And then the idea could be that you could, for example, stay up a little bit later, or you also eat a little bit later, or even eat during the night. Well, in those situations, the circadian rhythm is not in line with the intake patterns of the food. So it means that you are normally pre-programmed according to what you're doing during the day, and suddenly one day in the week, you're shifting your dietary patterns and you're eating very late in the evening. Well, the amounts and the type of food that you are consuming late in the evening in these situations is not well controlled. So the clock genes are actually not in parallel synthesized according to food intake. And this means that the regulation process is less efficient. And it may be possible that more lipids, for example, in those situations are stored in the adipose tissue, meaning that in those cases, the risk for becoming obese could be higher. And this is typically for disrupting, let's say, normal daily or daily behavior of humans. The same thing can be said with breakfast, amount of breakfast. For example, if you are a breakfast eater, so you wake up in the morning and 50% of your calories are coming from breakfast, and you do that for a certain amount of period of time, then normally the body is fully pre-programmed to know how much it has to take in and where the excess can be stored. The chances of becoming obese are a little bit less than usual. However, if we would change the dietary regime and we would mainly be eating our major meals in the evenings, while breakfast is extremely low in activity, in those situations, it may be possible that again, your biological clock is wrongly programmed. And in this way, the chances of having deposit of extra energy is much larger. So giving you more risks of potentially becoming obese. So I told you something about circadian rhythms, about how this could influence fat deposit. So of course, the next step is now to try and understand how we can measure the caloric content of foods. And in this way to know how much calories are physically entering into the human body. The first traditional way of calculating caloric densities is by working with a caloric bomb. So the principle is very simple. You have a closed container. The closed container is submerged into water, and there is a shaker there, and there's a temperature control, so you can actually measure the temperature of the water. The container itself is called a bomb because you put the food in there, which is organic material, you add an overdose of oxygen, and then you close the system. You put the system in a water bath and you start heating. At that moment, you will see that all the organic material that is physically present in the food will be decomposed and will be used to generate energy. The amount of energy can be obtained by the 4-9-4 rule, so 4 kilocalories for proteins, 4 kilocalories for lipids, and 9 kilocalories for carbohydrates. Sorry, for lipids, 9 kilocalories, and for carbohydrates, 4 kilocalories. The first way to measure it is the caloric bomb. So we start heating the system, everything is converted, and you have release of heat. The release of heat will increase the temperature of the water. So you just measure the temperature of the water as a measure for the total amount of energy that was contained within the food. So this way of working gives you a number of figures. You can see them here. We call that the gross energy. Yeah, so the total amount of energy that is physically contained within the foods. If you measure that for the carbohydrates, you can see here some numbers. Then we have an average of 17.1 kilojoules per gram, which is 4.1 kilojoules per gram. For the lipids, 39.7, 9.5, and for the proteins, 23.8, 5.7. So this is the total amount of energy that is contained in the product. It's not necessarily the amount of energy that you will be able to use to generate ATP. So the conversion factors, if you're working with gross energies, are 4.1, 9.5, and 5.7 kilocalories per grams. Here it is a little bit lesser, so we lose less. But here for proteins, we lose a lot, probably because we have urine production. And there is ureum there, so each time protein is broken down, the urea has to be produced, it requires energy, and that's why the energetic efficiency of protein is far less than this one of carbohydrates and fats. So for gross energy, you can actually see here what the average values are. Now you can start playing with this, like in biochemistry. So you can look at, for example, the total amount of gross energy that you can find in 1 mole of product, either carbohydrates, fats, acetic acid, propionic acid, butyric acid, and protein. And here you can see the gross energy coefficients. Technically speaking, if I start from carbohydrates like glucose, then I can go to the glycolysis, and from the glycolysis I can continue in the Krebs cycle. And this will generate for me ATP. According to biochemistry, total amount of ATP produced will be 38. So I can multiply the 38 molecules of ATP with an average energy density that is physically present in the cells, or in the nutrients in this case. So it means that I will have a yield by using the total amount of ATP that is physically present within the ATP molecules, divided by the total amount of energy that was physically present in the food. And the 38 has to be multiplied with the energy conversion factor, which for ATP in the human body and for ATP synthesis will be around 50 kilocalories or kilojoules per mole. So you have 38 times 50 and you divide by 2,816, and then you get 68% yield. While for fat, this will be 65. So as I already told you, the yields between the two substrates is very low. And then you can go for short chain fatty acids and protein. Protein is the least efficient, and acetic acids and propionic and butyric acid are somewhere in the middle of the efficiency yield. So it also means that if you want to have the most efficient energy source for humans, then you need to take carbohydrates or lipids, because lipids is technically speaking not that far away from carbohydrates. But you can't take protein because the total energy contained and the efficiency is much lower compared to carbohydrates and fats. And the short chain fatty acids are a little bit intermediate with the situation of carbohydrates, or here below the protein situation. It looks a little bit theoretical, but you can make it more practical. And this is a first problem-based learning question for which you use a few lines to answer your question. So it's all for the groups A, and we will discuss that in the next theoretical lecture. So it's about a person, and this person is eating a banana. And you can eat the banana either non-ripened, which means that um, the different connections are not well broken down. The starch in this case is enzyme resistant, and it's not really easily reachable by enzymes. So technically speaking, it is possible that the starch is there, but the enzymes are not capable of breaking it down. For example, because you are consuming intact seeds. Inside the seeds, there is starch, but this starch is not accessible for us. So if you have a non-ripened banana, then we could assume that the energy resistant starch is quite high, meaning that the banana will give you a lot of fiber and will not give you a lot of short-chain sugars. However, if you compare that with a yellow or a brown ripened banana, then we know that this banana is already quite advanced in the metabolism. And in this case, the banana will not that much rely on fibers, I would say, because the first part, the green banana, is mainly fiber rich. In the second case, when you have a yellow or a brown ripened banana, then it means that the starch is very well accessible. And in those cases, you will get more energy. So the question that I would like to ask you here is to try and explain a little bit to me. If you take the two bananas together, so the green banana and the yellow or brown banana, which of these bananas do you think would supply, from an energetic point of view, metabolic energy to the body? Which one would do that in the most efficient way, and why is that? And if you explain it, you need to use the tables. So you have this table that you can use with the energetic yield factors, and you are also allowed to use this one with the gross energy values. So try to come up with a sort of a strategy to understand how these two different bananas, although they might be the same if we wait a while, whereby the green banana can be converted into the yellow banana, but explain a little bit why the nutritional value and especially the energy content of both bananas is not the same. And explain it from a composition point of view, digestive point of view, and metabolism point of view. And so the whole pathway from consuming it up to producing ATP for the human body. So this is for groups A. How can we analyze it in another way? So we have already talked about the bomb calorimeter, but it's not an interesting instrument because it takes a long time to equilibrate it. It also gives you gross energies, which are not that relevant actually in human nutrition. So we need another technique, and the technique is actually the Rende analysis, whereby we're just going to measure the composition of the food. Then we're going to convert it with a conversion factor into total energy derived from that food. So if we want to know the water content, then you can measure the dry matter content by drying the food at 105 degrees Celsius. You can then use the dry matter and ash it at 550 degrees Celsius. And in this way, you have a measure for the organic material in the product. You can extract the fat by using solvents. This is the solvent extraction. And you can measure the nitrogen content by using Kjeldahl, which is a measure for crude protein. And this gives you a measure for the crude protein levels. Be careful because some foods may not contain proteins, but mainly contain NPNs, non-nitrogen protein nitrogen. So non-protein nitrogen, which means a certain amount of nitrogen that is physically present in the solution, but that is not really protein. Good examples are fish, for example, or breast milk. These products are extremely rich in NPN, And this is not really protein. So try to think a little bit about how you could subtract the potential bias of NPN in determination of crude protein. There's a very simple technique that you can use with the same technology to exclude the effect of NPN. So all these methods are quite classical, and then there's a new method now available for measuring enzyme total dietary fiber, TDF, is a test kit which is used by the labs. It can be criticized because the enzyme-resistant starch is not well measured, and we also lose some of the low molecular weight carbohydrates. So the remaining carbohydrates are then obtained by difference. So you start with 100 minus all the different fractions we already measured, and the remaining part is called the remaining carbohydrates. Dietary fiber has a definition, and it says that it contains edible carbohydrate polymers with 3 or more monomeric units which are not digested or absorbed in the small intestine in humans. So they can contain energy, but if you don't have the right enzymes to break it down, then it goes to the colon, and there it can be a source of energy that can go to the microorganisms. And this is usually a healthy approach to keep your microbiota healthy. The method works according to Prosky, so you're using enzymes to break down the product, and you correct for protein and ash. Lately, there have been some issues with soluble or insolubility of in this case, fiber. Insolubles are mainly cellulose, for example, the ones that you can find in cereal grains or legumes. Soluble in water is, for example, pectin or beta-glucans, like the ones you can find in fruits, for example, or some vegetables. So you can already see that if we want optimal health, then it's always better to combine insoluble and soluble fiber together, which means that you must have a good, healthy equilibrium between insoluble and soluble fiber. And there's also some problems still left with analytically determining all these fractions. The major problems we have is with the very low molecular weight fractions, as well as with the enzyme-resistant starch. There are some issues, although we are very close for a solution, that are not fully elaborated yet. So here you can see how the analytical method looks like. The total dietary fiber method, which is now proposed, is this ellipse here in the middle. It will analyze a large part of the resistant starch, all these different compounds that are cellular compounds and membrane outside components, like, for example, cellulose, beta-glucans, galactomannanes, arabinosilanes. So all these components are physically present in fiber and could potentially be bioactive. We can also measure pectins and arabinogalactanes, but polydextrose, for example, is only measured partly. And we have a lot of problems with raffinose, stachyose, and oligosaccharides, as well as with inulin. And these are products that are now already commercialized on the market, but it's very difficult to get the right analytical technique to analyze their presence in foods. And this brings us to the so-called Atwater factors, which are the conversion factors that bring the total amount of carbohydrate, protein, and fats into total energy amount. And here you can see how you calculate this. The Atwater factor is 494 or 173817, depending on the unit that you're using, meaning that the highest energy densities are obtained from the lipids and the lowest from the carbohydrates and the proteins. The energy that you get here, 494, is the energy that is contained on the package of a food product. So you can think a little bit which type of energy it was. I already asked that a while ago. Now, if we start from the gross energy for the three different fractions, carbohydrate, fat, and protein, you get these values. Of course, this is not what is physically consumed or used by the body, but that's the total amount that we can measure from the food that we take in. The digestibility coefficients don't seem to fluctuate, but probably this is not correct. We are lacking a lot of data on that. But to make it easier, there is an average digestibility coefficient defined for carbohydrates, for fats, as well as proteins. And for nitrogen, also the urinary nitrogen will be taken into account. So you will also check there whether the protein requirements are in this case met. If we have the urinary energy, then you can see that you are mainly losing it here by the protein. You don't lose any energy for carbohydrates or for fats. So technically speaking, the only correction you need to make for gross energy is for the digestible energy, for carbohydrates, as well as for fats. So you get 17.1 multiplied with 99 gives you 17. For fats, we have 39.7 times 95 gives you 38 energy containing, or in calories, it will be 9. But no corrections for the energy. While for protein, we start with 23.8, a digestion of 92%, but also a correction for urinary losses, because you have urine, which contains ureum, and the ureum contains the nitrogen that comes from the protein that is used to generate energy. So you have to correct for that. And the total amount you get then is 17 kilojoules per gram, or 4 kilocalories per grams. I hope it is more or less clear this, because it's an important table and it's not always that easy. So you have to think a little bit. If you are using Atwater factors, in all the situations you are working with foods. So if you want to know how much metabolizable energy will be available for humans, the only thing you need to do is to know the composition of the product and multiply it with the Atwater factors. And this will directly give you the amount of energy, metabolizable energy, that the body can use. It has already been corrected for urinary losses as well as losses in the digestive tract. We do not correct for gas energy. Yeah, this is too fluctuating, too variable, so we can't take that into our conclusions. If you want the digestible energy, then of course you start from the gross energy and you multiply, in this case, with the digestibility coefficient to give you the fraction that is actually lost in digestion. Think a little bit about the following question. If you would like to measure the energy content in a product, I already told you that you have to work with the Atwater factors, because the product is actually digested and then it is absorbed. So you need to correct for urinary losses as well as digestive losses. But which type of coefficients would you use if you start using the reserves in the human body? For example, you're going to use muscles to produce energy. Like in malnourishment, you actually sacrifice, in this case, the muscles to generate energy. How much energy do you think you can get from muscle use? Or you could mobilize the adipose tissue. And the question is there, how much energy could you mobilize from adipose tissue? Or from glycogen that is physically present in the liver or the muscles? Yeah, so it's not the same as Atwater in this case, because the product is already digested. It is physically present in the body, so you don't have to digest it the second time. So try to think a little bit what type of coefficients you're going to use for all the endogenous body reserves. So if we take this together, then we can actually say that the energy value of a food is determined by the chemical composition of the foods and by the Atwater factors. It's very straightforward. All different laboratories can do that. You can do that in a routine manner. So even if you have thousands of foods to analyze, you could just analyze in a routine manner all the chemical compositions, and then you just multiply with the Atwater factor to come to the energy content of the food. That's how it works. However, the system is extremely variable, and you can see that here. For example, if we work with lipids, we only assume that the lipids are triglycerides, but this is not true because there are also phospholipids. And phospholipids do not have the same energy value as compared to triglycerides. The carbohydrates have different chain lengths, and the chain length can also influence the energy content. There's also alcohol with a certain value, and there's also fiber, which nowadays has a value of 2 kilocalories per grams or 8.4 kilojoules per grams. It took legislation quite some time to come up with 2 kilocalories. It's lower than 4, which is normally for carbohydrates, but it's higher than 0 because we assume that the dietary fiber can be fermented by the bacteria in the colon, producing some partly gas, but also producing fatty acids, short-chain fatty acids, and these fatty acids supply energy to the host, and then this gives you then the 2 kilocalories per grams. Before I go to the next stage, I need to say something about ultra-processed foods. I think it is important that you understand the concept. And I'm telling it because in the last couple of months, a lot of articles have appeared in journals, as well as actually in newspapers, that are dealing with ultra-processed foods. So in other words, the society has discovered the term too, and is quite concerned about the extreme use of ultra-processed foods, especially in the Western diets. So first, what does it mean? An ultra-processed food is a processed food, but a food which is quite extremely processed. So it means that it is the most extreme case of classes that you can find according to the NOVA food classification. This is a classification system which is just based on the degree of processing of the product. You can have no processing, so then you have the raw products. You can have a minimal processing, an intermediate processing, and then a real ultra processing. So if we talk about this most extreme category of ultra processed foods, these are usually industrial formulations. And so, for example, it could be sausages, or it could be chips, or it could be French fries, it could be ice cream. So all these types of products that are very complex in structure, that cannot be produced at home in most situations, and mostly they are produced in factories, industrial formulations, which are then distributed through the supermarkets. We see that most of these products contain 5 or more ingredients. So they are really multi-ingredient-like, with a lot of different ingredients coming together so that it is not possible for you to know the original content of the product or the original structure or the original ingredients in the product. The unprocessed foods are not there, so they're not intact. They are actually broken down, restructured. And in order to keep the system stable, they usually also contain artificial substances. And so E numbers, additives, for example, like gums or stabilizers or emulsifiers, they will actually be added to keep the system as stable as possible. And in addition to that, we see that these types of foods are usually low in cost price. So also lower socioeconomical classes can easily buy it and use it. They're very convenient. They are pre-packed, so you can just take it in your school bag and eat them whenever you want. And they have a very long shelf life. They will not rot like in the case of vegetables or fruits. So you can keep them for a long period of time without changing nutritional value. And these products are usually very heavily marketed too. So these combinations of characteristics result in a new class of products which we call the ultra-processed foods. And there are studies now that illustrate the number of calories that are actually coming from ultra-processed foods. And you can see that in countries like, for example, USA or UK, the values are higher than 50% of the total daily energy intake, which is very, very significant. And for other countries, you can see that it steadily reduces, but still it can quite easily make 20% or more. So it means that also countries that are nowadays in transition, like for example Brazil or India or China, or all types of countries where we can also see a rise in the consumption of ultra-processed foods, meaning that they shift from traditional diets to more whole diets, diets that also contain a quite high frequency of ultra-processed foods. And the articles today also illustrate that consumption of ultra-processed foods significantly contributes to different types of disease patterns, like, for example, obesity. And this is an article from 2020, but I checked it already this year too. And you see that the number of articles in the last years is exponentially increasing. And for all of them, you see more and more interactions between ultra-processed foods on the one hand and several types of chronic disease patterns on the other hand. The study of Hull, which is also in Euphora, I think, I put it there for you to read in case you want, shows you a little bit the problem of ultra-processed foods. So just imagine that I have an ultra-processed diet on the left side, which is here indicated in blue, and a non-processed, well, non-processed is probably not correct. I mean, it is processed, but mildly, much less than that ultra. And this is then actually shown with the red curve. So what they actually have done is they made a crossover design. Two groups of people, one receives ultra-processed, the other one non or mild processed foods. They just measure the energy intake. You can eat ad libitum as much as you want. And then somewhere in the middle, you just switch the groups, whereby the other group gets now the mildly processed diets, and the other group gets the ultra-processed diets. And in the end of the process, you bring everything together, and you just analyze the amount of energy that was taken in by the food, as well as the body weight from these testing persons. And it seems that although the diets were completely the same, there was no difference in caloric content, sugar content, fat, fiber, and micronutrient content for the two. It's clearly indicated here that when you take ultra-processed diets, you take in 500 kilocalories more than when you would take the mildly processed diets, which is very significant. And there's no difference in nutritional value. So it's a little bit a striking result here from this study, which also leads, if you prolong that for a long period of time, you can also see that it increases body weight for the ultra-processed diets, but not for the mildly processed diets. And the way they explain it is mainly by looking at the structure of the food. So the food is restructured in such a way that people are more easily capable of consuming it, that the sensory profiles are a little bit different, that the digestion is more efficient, and that in this case you get higher amounts of calories that are, well, I would say taken in, but I'm not 100% sure of that. It's not well studied. We can just see that the intake of the calories is significantly different between the two groups. And this is explaining the effects that we see, for example, towards obesity.